I just want to thank Michael for inviting me to be part of this illustrious group. I've learned so much, and I'm really honored to be a part of these discussions. I also want to thank Michael for rekindling my interest in philosophy of biology. That's what I focused on earlier in my career. And then I got diverted into bioethics because I thought I wanted to do something really important and meaningful, and I think I have. But learning about Michael's work has really gotten me thinking about philosophy of biology again, because I think what he's doing is so groundbreaking and important. And I think we'll see that will come through in today's talk. So, what motivates this talk about Platonic space? Why are we here? Well, I think there's lots of reasons to go this way, but I think it seems that for Dr. Michael Levin, at least, it is the dealing with the behavior and morphology of xenobots. These are, of course, as we all know in this discussion, these are life forms that been made out of cells taken from frogs or even some human anthrobots and put together, and they all of a sudden do things that were not they're not, there's no basis in evolution. They start doing all these interesting behaviors and forming shapes and all this. And so the question is, how did they do this? How did they figure out how to do this? Where did this information come from? And this is so where Dr. Levin is saying that they are accessing information from Platonic space. So this is a non-physical space of truth, which we discover, not invent. The space as a structure that enables exploration. And so a lot of different things. He wants to take this Platonic space idea, not just into morphology, but behavior more broadly, minds, and it's got all kinds of things he wants to do with it. We can talk about that later. But today I just want to focus on just how it might play out in morphogenesis. So this is a sort of an idea, I think, of what he's getting at. So if you think of like just this caterpillar developing from an egg and becoming a butterfly at some point, it's making these changes, major changes in its morphology. And all along the way, it's being directed by goals. And so this is something that Dr. Levin has shown in his work, and he and I have worked on a couple of papers on this. So the idea is that this is not just a bottom-up process, like the emergence of the butterfly somehow from all this, but there are goals that this organism is pursuing that are directing it from the top down all along the way. And of course, these goals, he wants to say, are mathematical in form. So here's some questions I have for Dr. Levin. What is this Platonic space? What metaphysical commitments does Platonic space imply? Could the idea have practical and scientific value without a commitment to full-blown Platonism? Do we need it to explain and predict morphogenesis? Aren't genetics, physics, chemistry, and so on enough? How could groups of cells interact with it through their bioelectric network? How does the idea of a Platonic space help advance experimental work in practical applications in synthetic biology and other fields? And what are some testable hypotheses about Platonic space that could be investigated? And I hope to get to a lot of these questions today. So let's do a little bit of history and of science, history and philosophy of science, and going back all the way to Plato. And so when we're really talking about Plato, what he thinks of as Platonic space, he's talking about, of course, the forms of that are, we have this cave allegory where, everybody we're all just living in this cave. And all we see when we're making empirical observations of the world are the shadows on the wall. And to get at the true forms of things, we have to transcend this world of observation, step outside of the material world, and come in contact with the realm of forms. And then, there's all kinds of forms. You have forms of a horse, form of a man. These are independent of space and time. They're abstract. And of course, this is where mathematics lives for Plato as well. He had an interesting proof of this at the beginning of this proof. It's obviously elaborated in several of his dialogues, but there's a dialogue with Socrates, and Socrates is showing the slave boy basically what the area of this larger square would be based on the areas of the smaller squares, and the slave boy is following all along the way. And so what Socrates says that he's able to demonstrate is the slave boy has knowledge that he did not acquire from experience. He has no formal training in geometry, so he was born with this knowledge. It's a priori. In another dialogue, Socrates shows that our concept of equality could not have come from observation of things in the physical world, because no two things are exactly equal. And of course, in the Republic, we get the full-blown development with the cave allegory and everything for the theory of forms. So what Plato is talking about here, and this is still something that goes way beyond Plato, of course, is the idea of a priori knowledge, that there seem to be things that are true, that are objective, independent of all of us, and don't have anything to do with any particular experience that we have of the world. So, we, of course, have famous philosophers defending this. Descartes, the cogito, I think, therefore I am. And also Descartes also thought that mathematics was like this, that it was a priori. Kant, of course, has a priori knowledge of the categories of space and time and so on. Well, Aristotle had an objection to Plato's theory of forms, and it's an objection that still stands today, and it still comes up. So if knowledge requires interaction with things, we learn about things by somehow interacting with them physically, or other people have done this physically. How in the world can we have knowledge of the forms if they are transcendent? They stand outside of space and time in some Platonic heaven or something like this. Plato, said that basically knowledge is remembering that we have come in contact with the forms when our soul was in heaven. Aristotle really didn't buy this idea very much, and other modern Platonists have said that we have knowledge by intuition, but people have said this is equally mysterious. So Aristotle held that the forms are in the world somehow, that there's the things in the world are a combination of their matter and their form, and that we can actually have knowledge of the forms empirically by observation, induction, and a process that he called abstraction. Aristotle also developed the ideas, very important in philosophy of science, of four causes: the efficient, material, final, and formal, with the final cause being the goal, the formal cause being like the form or the structure of something, material, the stuff it's made out of, and the efficient things, the things pushing it along. So his ideas dominated philosophy and science for 1,500 years until really the scientific revolution. And then we have big figures, everyone from Copernicus, Vesalius, Descartes, Galileo, Newton, all defending the idea that true science does not have final causes. It really does not have formal causes either. So they were really looking at the efficient and the material causes of things, and that everything would be mathematicized and proven experimentally, not just by observation and induction like Aristotle did. So that was the great revolution in physics. But interestingly, in biology, things did not go, the search for final causes did not go away so quickly. There was still a lot of biologists still saw the need to talk in terms of final causes and teleology and function in language like that, even if the physicists were sort of abandoning that. And interestingly, you also see at this time this idea of and being defended by very important biologists, Lamarck, Cuvier, Richard Owen, all believing in the existence of pre-existing archetypes of organisms. So the idea, and this that there is Platonic, if you will, there are actually pre-existing forms in biology that are kind of timeless, and they're out there, and organisms instantiate or actualize these forms. That was the idea that a lot of biologists took very seriously back then. Well, Charles Darwin really sort of undid a lot of this with the Darwinian, his theory of natural selection, where biological form, it comes about by evolution. It's a historical and contingent process. It's not dependent on pre-existing forms. So species are historical accidents. They're not natural kinds. Things could have turned out very differently. There's nothing really making things the way they go. There's no goal in evolution, no purpose in evolution, no divine purpose or any purpose at all. So for Darwin, everything is just sort of blind mechanism. Life, that's what life is. Well, this, had, of course, a tremendous impact in biology, but then very important person comes along who I think, Dr. Levin and others are sort of carrying on his legacy, is Darcy Thompson. So he was, really trying to understand the mathematical basis behind biology. And he did not think life was entirely an accident, that it was constrained and shaped by physics and chemistry, and not just the bare physical mechanisms, but the mathematical structures underlying physics and chemistry. So here you see some drawings of the shape of fish that he had and how you could transform the shape of a fish mathematically and get sort of different species of fish from this. Here we have a quote from him: God always geometrizes. Their problems of form are at first instances of mathematical problems. So he's really taking this mathematical approach to biology. He also thought that just looking at something like an amoeba, you could understand it entirely in terms of surface tension, water diffusion, electrical and chemical forces. Plasmodium, again, he didn't think there was any purposeful action here. This could all be explained by surface tension and things going on with cells, physical forces, nothing more than that. He also had some interesting analogies between physical things, physical structures, like you have a water droplet here, and then analogous structures in the biological world. So he thought similar mathematical principles were governing both of these things. He did some work on spirals, spiral shells, and found logarithmic relationships. And of course, he understood that the Fibonacci series was the structure that was behind the Nautilus shell, as well as pine cones and other structures that you see in biology. So Thompson's view of all this then is that math underlies biological form, but it's embedded in the laws of physics and chemistry. So math constrains physics and chemistry, and complex patterns emerge from the bottom up. There's nobody seeking these patterns. They just sort of come up from emergence. Alan Turing has this similar sort of view about things. So he's developed mathematical models of how you can explain complex patterns, pigmentation patterns, by things like symmetry breaking, and the downstream effects of morphogens. So there, again, there's no need to presuppose that anybody is seeking any cause or anything like seeking any goal. It just sort of emerges. You get this same sort of idea with Raup in his work on the morphospace. So he did have an idea of morphospace, very important here. Different spaces that, for instance, shells could occupy in their morphology. But again, he didn't think that they were actively navigating this space. He thought they were getting pushed around the morphospace by physics and chemistry. And you get Waddington's idea.
Oh, could I jump in with a question before you get to Waddington? Um,
Yeah.
so what was, and particularly in the previous slide, what was Turing's definition of symmetry breaking? You know, that comes up a lot and nobody ever really gives a clear definition that I've seen.
I'm going to have to put that question off because I really am not an expert on. I've read his paper, but I'd have to go back and look at his. I don't know what he meant by. I think it was mathematically defined, obviously, but
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So Waddington, the same way that you have this, he comes up with the idea of the epigenetic landscape. And again, it's like this realm of possibilities for forms, but no one is actively seeking anything out. You're just rolling down the hill. The analogy, or you basically cells are getting pushed along different paths. So even before Michael Levin's work came along, there were definitely problems with this emergence paradigm, right? Now, obviously, there's been a lot of great work done on this. We have, morphogens, work on morphogens, morphogen gradients, homeobox genes, symmetry breaking was mentioned, bending, folding, all kinds of stuff you can see that cells are doing as they're during development. But there's just some problems. It's like there just seems to be much more information in development than you can get out of all this. Like, for example, the eye. Can you really explain the development of a really complex, a complex organ like the eye from these kinds of things? I mean, you can get, genes that are necessary for an eye to be formed at all. That if you don't have a particular protein, you can't get certain pigments in your eye. Yes, you can get that, but it really seems to be there's much more information here than you get just from all these mechanisms. Another thing that Levin has pointed out in his work is that even when you have all this kind of mechanical stuff working underneath, you still need to know when to stop. When to stop, when you've reached the point you're supposed to stop in development, in initiating this pattern, and also why you're pursuing this particular pattern in the first place as opposed to another one. So I'm not going to go through, his experimental work. I think you're familiar with his work on, two-headed planaria and getting planaria to grow heads from species that are very distant related in evolution. The xenobots we mentioned earlier, being able to make a tadpole grow a eye on its, where eyes are not supposed to be. Now, all this work is really challenging the emergence paradigm head on, right? It's basically showing that that organisms are pursuing goals in development and other processes, that these goals are internally represented in bioelectric networks and possibly other mechanisms, that the goals tell the organism where to go in the morphose space and when to stop, and that organisms are basically intelligent uh, agents pursuing goals, and that there can be degrees of intelligence corresponding to sort of how much goal directedness you have as a system. That you can have things that are more and more goal directed. You know, you have very simple things like cells, but then you have very complicated things like human beings, and that we are all collective intelligences. And this sort of a model for then how these bioelectric networks work. If you look at the computer model, where you have down at the bottom, you have transistors, and then you can have, you know, logic gates and all this, getting up to, say, an image on a screen. You could have this sort of same thing going on with at the level of the cells with gap junctions, if operating as like transistors, and then networks, and on the way, all the way up. So this does raise questions, though. If their cells are acting on information that does not come to them directly from physics, genetics, physics, or chemistry, where does it come from? And this is where Dr. Levin wants to say that it comes from Platonic space, and that cells access it using their bioelectric networks. So we should be able to use math to study this then, to figure out how we can get cells to do certain things. We could study it independently, do experiments, of course, but also model it mathematically. And so presumably there's a lot of different mathematics. I've seen different presentations that have been part of this seminar on how you would use mathematics to do this. That's very interesting. That's not my specialty. I know some mathematics, but not all that you see up here on the screen. So I want to talk about the philosophy of mathematics, though, and how we sort of can make sense of this. So mathematics is philosophically perplexing, I think. It seems to be about objective facts, right? We seem to, you know, 1 + 1 = 2. That seems to be just an objective fact, right? But when we think about that, we think about other facts, like, say, the Statue of Liberty is in New York Harbor. Now, for that statement to be true, we think that the thing that it's talking about exists, that there's this Statue of Liberty somewhere, and it's in New York Harbor, and we could actually go out and touch the Statue of Liberty, go in New York to New York Harbor and verify it. But what you say, something like 2 is an even number. Well, okay, where is 2? Where does it exist? How could we actually verify that? So 2 is an abstract object, this number with no particular location in space and time. So, okay, well, maybe it's like this. Sherlock Holmes is a brilliant detective. We can say that's true, and we actually don't need to be able to go and reach out and touch Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes is a fictional character, and we basically are saying that Sherlock Holmes exists in our minds or our language or something like that. So maybe numbers are like that. They're just some kind of fiction, and that's how we can say true things about them. So this sort of little puzzle leads to the sort of basic positions in the philosophy of math. There are more positions here than, you know, I've shown you on the slide, but I think these cover a lot of territory right here. So the basic division is between realism and non-realism. So realists, like Plato, think that mathematics is about objective facts that are independent of mind, language, or culture. And the non-realists deny this claim. So the supernaturalists, I want to call them, and are people that actually believe that mathematical objects exist in some kind of transcendent realm outside of the natural world. That's Plato's view. The more popular position, I think, today in philosophy of mathematics, Quine and others, W.V. Quine, Penelope Matty, my father, Michael Resnik, others, is that mathematical objects are in some part of the natural world, and the trick is explaining how that happens, of course. Then on the other side, you have the intuitionists like Kant and Brouwer, who think that mathematical objects are constructed by the mind and exist only in the mind. And then formalists like Hilbert, the great set theorists, who think that mathematical objects are symbols in a formal system, and they don't really refer to anything, that mathematics is just a game we play with language, not a Wittgensteinian game, but a very formal game. So I subscribe to mathematical realism. I think Dr. Levin does too. The most popular, the most influential argument for realism, it's not Plato's argument, which was based on a priori knowledge, but this argument that was developed by W.V. Quine and Hilary Putnam and others of the indispensability. So it goes something like this. Mathematics plays an indispensable role in formulating, testing, and applying theories, hypotheses, and so on used in science and other practices that have been highly successful in dealing with the physical world. The best explanation of the role of mathematics in these practices is that the physical world has a mathematical structure. So this is sort of the unreasonable success of mathematics. It just seems mathematics could not be this successful unless the world were actually mathematically structured. And so from that, you get then, and this is all the best, by the best explanation, you get sort of this realist view from the argument.
What is IBE?
I'm talking right here, inference to the best explanation.
Okay.
So it's a form of non-deductive reasoning that's used. It has actually been used in science. I think Darwin used it, and William Whewell used it. A lot of other people have used it. So the idea is that you have some evidence that you're given, and then the best explanation of that evidence is, say, a hypothesis, and then you infer that the hypothesis is probably true. Like I'm out at, say, North Carolina at night. I hear some howling at night. The best explanation is it's from coyotes. And so I believe that the howling was from coyotes. Now, this is, we can talk about this later, but this, not everybody, there are some controversies. What is the best explanation? What are criteria for a good explanation? Is this legitimate reasoning? Is it based on biased background theories and so forth? I think IBE is certainly a good place to start for explanations. But then maybe later you could go on to refine your explanations with statistical hypothesis testing or Bayesian inference. But I don't think it's a bad form of explanation in science or philosophy that matter, but it's important to understand what it is. There are also weaknesses of this argument. First of all, the argument only supports the math that's indispensable for science. Now, this may be a lot of math when we think about all the math that's used in science. And it may be actually that math has a unity to it such that it brings in all of math. But I just want to point out that's a limitation. Someone might say, well, this is not the best explanation of the usefulness of math in science and engineering. And my reply would be, well, show me a better explanation. You can explain the success of all this and say that, math is not really real. Anyway, so I think what you get out of this is you have to decide between whether you're going to be a supernaturalist or a naturalist about this. My father, who's a pretty good philosopher of mathematics, said I should just punt on this question for now because it is a tough question. Exactly what we're dealing with here. If you're a supernaturalist, you got to deal with those metaphysical issues of dualism. And then you got to explain how we could possibly know anything about mathematics. If you're a naturalist, you got to explain exactly how, math could be in the world. What are we talking about here? How can the world really be mathematically structured? How can math be in the world? So here's a sort of a view that I think seems reasonable about this, of how math structures the world. Let's just take a very simple example of a game of dice, where we have, two six-sided dice, and math delineates a structured space of possibilities for the game. You can roll a 2, a 3, and so on, total up to 12 for the die. But it also tells you what you can't do. So it constrains the game. You can't roll a 0, you can't roll a 1, you can't roll a 13, and so on. So let me look at a few explanations where I think this sort of plays out, that math creates a space of possibilities, but it also constrains things. So I think, there's great examples of this in physics. I'm not a physicist. I'm not going to use those examples. Symmetry is a big deal here. But I will use some biological examples I'm more familiar with. Cicadas, for example. There are, as we know from periodical cicadas, they're 13 or 17 years. And Gould is in 1977 proposed that the reason for this is that 13 and 17 are prime numbers, and it's harder for a predator to synchronize their life cycle with the life cycle of a cicada if it's a prime number. Like, for example, if you had a 12-year life cycle, the predator could eat you 4 times, if they had a 3-year life cycle. So what this example shows is that mathematics creates a structured space of possibilities for life cycles that can be explored by evolution over time. And eventually you get 13 or 17 out of this because of the advantages, it's advantageous to these cicadas to have a life cycle like this. Another example, infertility of mules. So, basically this happens because in meiosis, you have to, the cells have to divide in half. The chromosomes have to be, divided in half. So if you have 64 chromosomes, you're fine. You get 32 on each for the gametes. But if you have 63, this doesn't work. Now, actually, I've read that for some reason, like a very small percentage of mules really are fertile. I'm not sure what's going on there, but basically, they're not fertile because of this math problem. And so it's the mathematics of odd versus even numbers that constrains what can happen really in terms of reproduction. Another example, this is an interesting one. This is Darcy Thompson discussed this example, and this is the example of the form of cells made by honeybees, and so you see this as a hexagon. Darcy Thompson thought that math actually forced this to happen, that the laws of the chemistry and physics, the forces acting on the wax and geometry and so forth, produce this structure. Well, this is partly the case, but not entirely the case, because if the bees decide to make a sort of a different structure, things play out very differently. So you see here, the bees have made a queen cell, and that you can see little sort of hexagonal patterns on it somewhat, but it's a very different shape. So again, mathematics creates a space of shapes that the bees and natural selection can explore over time. So here's the view of this, is that math is like a superstructure on the world. It's the canvas on which natural phenomena can occur. So if we go back to comparing Thompson and Levin on this, Thompson was talking about constraints on morphogenesis coming from mathematics, that if you start a growth pattern a certain way, that you have to take a certain shape. The math, physics, and all that forces you to do this. Levin is talking more about not constraints. I'm sure he's not opposed to constraints, but also possibilities, that we have this, that math creates this space of possibilities, possible forms that organisms can choose from. So if you think again like a crystal, so we have Thompson would be like, well, we get this crystal shape by, just math and physics and chemistry tell us how this crystal shape emerges. But Levin's sort of idea is that, no, looking at the pyramids, and we have a mathematical shape here, and it's because human beings were using some kind of mathematical pattern to direct the formation of the pyramids. So if we think about this then, like we're using math to form the pyramids, so we can do this, right? So if we want to make a shape, we can do this. We can mentally represent a shape, like someone cutting a piece of wood here. Maybe they want to make a particular shape out of the wood. But we need to have feedback about the shape so that we know when we've cut it right, right? There's this, saying measure twice and cut once, right? So you need to actually interact with the shape, mentally represent it, and so that tells you when you've got to where you need to go, right? So yes, we can do this through our brains, right? So how could cells do this? Well, this is, sort of my understanding of what Levin thinks is going on here. And there's people that can do a lot better job of representing this than me, I'm sure. But the idea is that these mathematical forms are represented in the bioelectric network of the cells. The cell collectives, they have these bioelectric networks. There's also input from the genome and the environment. And I think also importantly, there has to be input from sensation. The cells have to have some kind of mechanism for sensing the external world they're in, their own shape in the world, so they can know what shape they're forming, if they're really, seeking a goal. So this is sort of, Dr. Levin shared this slide with me too about sort of how this could be happening in bioelectrical networks, how we could use mathematics to represent what's going on here. Now, an interesting thing about this that I've thought about, and I think this is a very interesting hypothesis to test, is that if we think of the relationship between morphospace and the bioelectric networks in this way, it actually suggests that cells may have primitive mathematical abilities because they need to be able to navigate through the morphospace. And to do this, they need, we'll just put quotes around this, concepts of space and time. Now these may be very, very, very rudimentary concepts, whatever we're talking about here. But this idea suggests that this could scale up as cognition scales up. And there's actually very interesting research on the mathematical abilities of other species, including even slime mold, right? That they somehow can use math to figure out how to get around in the world. And so I think this is a very interesting result of this view, definitely worth exploring in more depth. So I want to conclude then. During morphogenesis, multicellular organisms can use bioelectrical networks to access, internally represent, and utilize information from a structured space of possible forms. This information can be understood as an Aristotelian formal cause of morphogenesis. It structures morphogenesis by delineating a mathematical space of possible morphologies and constraining the process of morphogenesis. The goals pursued by organisms during morphogenesis can be viewed as Aristotelian final causes characterized in mathematical terms for the morphospace itself or the electrical chemical space of the bioelectrical networks. This view is compatible with more traditional emergence views that come from the bottom up, but we're also talking about top-down sort of processes here. Some further questions. How to model the morphospace mathematically, how to model the electrochemical space mathematically, what's the relationship, statistical, causal, or otherwise, between these two spaces, and also relationship between these spaces and actually what happens in morphology. How can all this be mapped onto each other? How do bioelectric networks regulate cell behavior? How we can use this to make predictions. Do bioelectric networks have set points? How can these be changed? How has the use of electricity by cells evolved over time? Do microscopic organisms have mathematical abilities? Could a xenobot solve a maze or be trained to distinguish between numbers of objects? I'd like to ask Dr. Levin that question, see if they'll look at that. And can this idea of Platonic space be extended to other things like genetic regulatory networks, organ systems, animal behavior, ecosystems? And so what would the relationship be between all these different types of Platonic space? And then obviously the practical applications of all this in synthetic biology, regenerative medicine, and so on. So I'm going to stop sharing and take questions. Oh, hold it. I will thank Dr. Levin. There's a slide for my acknowledgement. I'll thank Dr. Levin and also my father, Michael Resnik, and Mark Lang, who also is a philosopher that gave me some useful comments about all this. So I'll take questions now. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, David. Do people have comments, questions? I have some stuff, but let's see if anybody else has anything first.
Yeah, I do have a sort of question. Thanks for the great talk. So you had this one slide where you showed that math is sort of a superset of several other fields. But I feel like, but maybe this is a different perspective. Maybe you're talking about something different, but I feel like even within math, there's lots of regions where math itself cannot be used to explain stuff produced by math. For example, even Turing system, right? It's defined by a set of mathematical equations, and you can do some math and derive some conditions like in the ratio of the activator and inhibitor must be greater than a certain number for the system to be able to produce the patterns. But then, so far as I know, there is no math that can actually be used to predict exactly what patterns will be generated by a system. You can use computation, simulation to see the patterns, but there is no math yet to predict, to calculate exactly what patterns would be produced. Do you see this as some kind of contradiction, or is it just a case of where we don't yet have the tools in math, that math is not complete yet? What do you think?
I would say probably the latter, okay? That math is not yet complete. And I will say our math, okay? So when I'm talking about mathematics as a superstructure, I'm not actually saying that that superstructure is sets or numbers or topology, anything that is a human representation, right? That's our math, right? But there is the math, the structure of the universe, right? So what is going on with us is that the math that we do, whether it's set theory or whatever branch of mathematics we're working on, we keep on discovering more about the math, the superstructure that's out, that structures our whole universe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I guess, yeah, I mean, even in mathematics research, they still keep producing a number of techniques, and I keep reading articles about how different fields in mathematics are connected, like algebraic geometry and the high energy physics and whatnot. And so I guess, yeah, math is not complete yet in that sense.
Yeah, I would say it's not complete.
So I think, Santosh brings up a really interesting point that I think it has to do with the nature of explanation and what it is that we want from our models, which is the difference between simulation and explanation, right? So let's say, which I think you were talking about, Santosh, in the context of these Turing patterns. Think about the glider in the game of life. If I asked you to explain the glider, what you could do very easily is show me the 4 steps and convince me that yes, in fact, every 4 steps or whatever it is, the thing moves along and is regenerated and so on. So you could show me that. Now that's a simulation. Is that an explanation? Have you explained anything, or have you just shown me that yes, actually, if we crank through the micro states, then in the end it does what we think it does? And this I think is really important in biology too, because it's one thing to say we've understood something, and is it the same to say, oh, I have a simulator that simulates all the molecular events, and I can sort of crank it forward faster than the real biology goes and tell you exactly what's going to happen. That's great, and that's a simulation. But what is it that we actually mean when we've explained something, and what does it mean to explain anything from the glider up versus simply go through the steps and convince yourself that that's exactly what what seems to happen? So I think that's
I think
a
that's
question.
a good point. I mean, I don't really think you have a complete explanation yet when you have a simulation. I actually wrote a paper a number of years ago when I was doing philosophy of biology called "How Possibly Explanations in Biology," right? And this was used a lot in evolution, like how possibly could this have happened, right? How possibly could, say, multicellularity have arisen? How did it happen, right? And a simulation, I think, is a similar way. It's like giving us sort of how this could happen, right? But to nail it down, it's a good starting place, but then to nail it down, it seems like you need more really specific testable hypotheses about how this is really happening in some system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes yes, and I think it goes even beyond that, because you could have the details of how it happens in the system. And so is all that we're really looking for is a set of the actual steps, right? The micro steps that the actual system follows, and you can track it through, and okay, that's what it's doing. Is that really an explanation? I feel like what we want from a real explanation is a better compression than that. We don't just want all the micro steps. We want some kind of a symmetry, or some kind of a deep structure of the thing that lets us understand what's going on without having to go through all and simulate.
Well, I guess I want to say both. I think your simulation is great because the simulation to me gets at a deeper structure, right? That's how you're able to generate the simulation, as I understand it, right? Is that you have certain principles that you're using to generate the simulation, and that is the deeper thing, right? But
But the
then,
But the simulation might be something, I mean, eventually it's all what Schrodinger's equation, or something that isn't biology at all, right? If you wanted to be a real reductionist about it, you could say, look, I'm just going to simulate the particles and the fields, and whatever happens, happens, and then there is no biology, right? I'm sure there's people who feel that way too.
all right, maybe you have a different understanding, but I always think of a simulation more like a mathematical model, right? Of something. And
Hananel, did you want to say something?
yeah.
No, I think my question is different, and I think Doug have really to that point. So please continue.
Oh, Well, okay, I was just going to jump in and say, to me, an explanation, it's like a car. You got a system and it's got parts, and those parts are systems that have parts. And so the question is, what are the parts that I want to see used to make an explanation? And I'll give you a nice example. I had a chemistry postdoc in the lab, and I was trying to explain something to her in terms of energy levels, and she said, "Oh, you used to be a physicist because we talk in terms of rates." And so what you believe, what your basis vector set is out of which you want to see used to make an explanation can differ from person to person, but I think that's what we're really trying to get at. And so I think David's not wrong. I think he's hoping that somewhere the computer program had some basis vector set of principles that was using to make the simulation, but I think the explanation part is identifying those parts and how they fit together. I once had a med student who said, well, I have a generalization when just knowing all the facts will do. And so I won't get off on med students, but that sort of illustrates the point, is there's a difference between the explanation and the simulation and the actual sum of all the events.
Yeah, Hanina?
My comments is something else. Again, I'm not a philosopher, not by all means. So maybe what I'm saying is a heresy or stupid, either way. I'm not sure what math is. Is math a language like English, Chinese, Hebrew, that's kind of language? Because it's not Hebrew or English is not a very defined set of rules like in math. And if math describes nature, that's something completely different than language describe nature. So if I'm going back to the slide that you show on the cicadas, for example, I can get a different explanation for that. And that's where I'm not sure that how math defining this kind of, or explain this kind of phenomenon. For example, again, I'm not a biologist also, so I'm guessing here, assuming that every cicada have some part that will define the time that will take it to go sleep. And that part have, as usual, as an evolution, have a different exploratory range. And assuming that there is many cicadas, there is many possibilities of that variable. And somehow nature or the environment decide to kill all of the different permutation and leave only those permutation because there is nothing to counteract the permutation that they found. So technically, the cicada didn't find the prime numbers. They just accidentally bumped to it. So in a way, mathematics is not, they didn't find the mathematical proof or mathematical explanation. They just mathematics know how to describe it in a sort of language way. And I'm not sure how to what I can make of math in that sense. Where I should put it in what categories I should put it according to these slides.
Well, okay. I guess it goes back to the other question. I think there's a difference between the math that is part of our language and proofs and everything, and actually mathematical facts. That I would say that prime numbers existed before human beings existed. The periodical cicadas were around before human beings existed. And somehow they happened upon a fact of the world, right? About
Right.
prime numbers. They happened upon it. So I guess, yeah, I would say, I believe that there are actually mathematical facts that have actually not, that can be represented in human language, but they are actually independent of human language. I mean, you can have people from all around the world, speaking different languages. You hold up, two hands and they understand that I've got one hand and, they understand that, right? And in even crows and honeybees can somehow have these concepts of numerosity that has nothing to do with human language. So that, to me, that suggests that math is somehow just part of the structure of things that we've managed to happen upon in our interactions with the world. But it's another question. Yeah.
Sorry, if I may quickly add to that, I think if you visualize solutions based on, say, prime numbers in the fitness landscape, okay, so maybe solutions based on prime numbers or the more optimum stuff parts of the landscape, and evolution just uses its search to find that optimum, right? So if you view it in that way, then there is no contradiction, right? If the math-based solutions are the most optimum, then evolution cannot use logic to find the solution. So it just searches around and it just happens hits the bottom, and it just happens to be the most optimum solution.
Yanbo?
Yeah. My question might sounds a bit self-contradictory because so in one side my question was how was this mathematical structure related to goal directness? Like when you want to embed a lot of things together without wasting space, you might got the hexagon structure like B cell. And I just wondering how do you think about the relationship between the goal and the math structure? However, there's some book that some people have different opinion. Like when I read the book, the self-reproductory automata theory, they cited something from Gödel. So he basically say that when something is complex enough, the explanation of that object could be more complex than just simply describe that thing. So yeah, I just want to know your opinion.
Well, I think this is more an area for the mathematicians to work on. In a very general sense, just think of somehow like a human being building a pyramid, right? And let's say they have this shape, this representation of a shape of what it's supposed to be, the pyramid, right? That is a goal, but it's also a mathematically defined goal, this shape, right? This shape of the pyramid. Now, what I think Dr. Levin wants to say, and again, I think he's going to have to get the mathematicians like you to help him work on this, is, okay, how do organisms represent these mathematical forms, right? What's going on there? How are they doing this, right? I think it's clear that we can do it. We know that we human beings can somehow do this, right? We can build pyramids. We can cut boards to a specific length. So we must be able to represent mathematical forms internally in our brains. And so the question then for you, the mathematicians is like, okay, how does this happen? That's not really my realm of expertise. I can understand it at a very big picture level, but I'm not going to be able to provide you the mathematical details of how it happens.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Jacob.
Hello. So I just wanted to come back actually to the question that you raised, Hananel, about the sort of status of mathematics in scientific explanation. So as you all will see in the recording of my talk in this series, my favorite definition of mathematics comes from Hirsch and Davis's book, The Mathematical Experience, where they define mathematics as the study of mental objects with reproducible properties. I mean, this is actually quite a mysterious definition. If you think about it, it raises all of these questions about how it is that we are somehow able to kind of point our minds at these objects whose properties are sort of reproducible under various mental manipulations that we can make. But, you know, I think you have put your, even if you are a sort of Platonist about mathematical objects, which I am, you know, what are we doing when we invoke mathematical objects in scientific explanation? I mean, one way of describing it is to say that we're taking something that could be stated entirely in natural language, but with, you know, strong relations of logical entailment between like the various steps we make in the natural language argument, and then sort of compressing and substituting them. So I mean, in some sense, there is almost, you could say, a way in which a mathematical explanation itself depends almost on a kind of ingression type picture. In other words, we're like bringing in and allowing this sort of sequence of sort of for free logical compulsion that we get from the structure of mathematical objects to help tell us something about the physical world, but that in principle, you know, what we're doing is just replacing something that would be a long, difficult, and natural language argument with something that's like a much more compressed version of that same sequence of, like, you know, essentially compulsions in cognition. But then this raises the question, this problem that David Resnik pointed out, of like how it's the sort of the flip side of the causal formal relationship. How do formal things it's easy to understand how they compel our thinking. How do they compel things in the physical world? So yeah, I think it all turns around that same complex of the relationship between the Platonic space and the sort of physical world, which is why I'm so glad we're talking about all this stuff.
So you raise a lot of interesting points. So I guess I want to say that there is the structure of the physical world, which is inherently a mathematical structure, but there's a structure of our language which mirrors the physical world, but it's not. And so logic, like you know, Russell and Whitehead took 400 pages to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, or something like that, right? In their Principia math, and they had it all tightly worked out in terms of the logic of set theory and everything to do this. So yes, you could do that, right? But of course, obviously, Gödel and everyone told us there's limitations to all that kind of our logic, right? But it might just be a shorthand to say, well, no, it's a fact. 1 + 1 = 2. It's a fact. We don't need to go through 400 pages of logical proofs. But it's very puzzling. I'm still very puzzled about it. And this is the best that I can do with it right now. But I somehow feel in my gut, and I think Dr. Levin has helped me convince me of this, and my own father, that there really are mathematical facts, and they're somehow really part of the structure of the world. I think that's as far as I can get with it. But it's reconciling that with our language, proof systems, all that, which is obviously not the same thing. Does that help you, or does that at least tell you what I think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I totally agree with you that in some sense, the sort of simplest solution to a lot of these problems, which many scientists have resisted for a long time, is, as you said, the idea that these mathematical facts are just part of our reality and are sort of in the world at the ground level, which I personally totally agree with and endorse. So,
Yeah, thank you.
Doug, were you
Katrina.
first?
Oh, no, I think
Oh,
Doug did
yeah.
Katrina, whatever.
Okay. Yeah, Jacob raised, I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but you kind of raised the point that language is sort of a engineering interface between mathematics and our brains, and so kind of a pragmatic thing. And I think I can put an even finer point on it, which is that as to this interface and how much our brains can do with regard to this abstract mathematics. I'm pretty sure that you cannot design a jet airplane using Roman numerals. I don't think humans could do it, even though it's still arithmetic.
Well, you probably, yeah. Well, now, why do you say that?
Because I think you need the decimals. That's interesting. Why do I say that? So I think you need the Arabic numbers and the decimals in order to be able to do it. And I'm not even sure what an equation for like so I had, say I had an equation for the structural behavior of an airplane wing. I'm not even sure how I would plug Roman numerals into it.
Okay, so I'll push back against that.
Okay.
Maybe we just haven't developed our Roman numeral systems in a sophisticated enough way to do that.
I could
Or-
even
So
Okay.
I think this is a
Can
good
I add to
discussion
this?
though, because I think this is important to understand. There are Roman numerals, there's binary, maybe an
Yeah.
octopus uses 8 or whatever to count by. I mean, but that's part of how we represent what's going on.
Mhm.
We can
There is
use
a
binary.
pragmatics to that. What? There is obviously a pragmatics to that. Some symbol systems are going to work better than others for doing certain things,
Mhm.
but we all may also have to be open to the possibility that we just need to develop these symbol systems better to do certain things, right?
So, okay. So I guess I would rephrase it as we don't have enough cortical layers to be able to handle whatever that improved Roman numeral system would be. On the other hand, now that you got me thinking about it, we don't really have enough cortical layers to design an airplane as it is. We're using computers to design them.
Right.
But anyway, the point is there's this pragmatic barrier between the abstract math and what we see the world as.
Right. I mean, and this comes up in science all the time, right? Not just in math, but the pragmatics of scientific explanation and our concepts, the concepts that we find useful and not useful. And it comes back to the limitations of our brains, to understand the world, right? Anyway, Katrina, you've got a question.
Yeah, well, it's related to what you're talking about, which is the pragmatics. And I guess I just want to share this idea from Wittgenstein, which would say more that those pragmatics are fundamental and more epistemological. Like he wrote a critique of the Principia and the way that they took 400 pages to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, and said that if the outcome had been 1 + 1 = 3, we all would have gone, well, I think you need to go back and redo that math, because our empirical experience of being people in the world is that if I have one apple and another apple, that's 2 apples. So we were validating and verifying our mathematics against our experience of being in the world. And I think it's hard to get away from that. I know that there are sort of non-empirical mathematical truths that can only be deduced logically, but I'm skeptical of the kind of mathematical realism that doesn't still somehow tie into being a person in the world, which makes me more aligned with the kind of Jan Brouwer constructivist mathematics. But I just wanted to share that Wittgenstein anecdote. He basically says if our mathematics doesn't align with our counting, we would get rid of the math, we wouldn't get rid of our counting. We know that that's true based on our experience.
Well, I mean, this is not a totally irrelevant issue at all. There's a question of whether we need to revise our logic, whether we need a three-valued logic in order to do quantum mechanics, right? So that's a pragmatic pressure on our math. Yeah, Quine, I don't know if you've read any Quine, but Quine has the view, and not everybody wants to accept this view, that if the universe were a very, 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 very different place, that maybe our math would have to be different too. That there's no fine line here between the empirical and the a priori empirical or whatever. I mean, I put that question to Dr. Levin too. I think he's not here before. I said, okay, well, the Big Bang never happened. Would there still be prime numbers? That may be a question that has almost no meaning, because it's like we're thinking of like a universe where there is no universe. And so maybe we're just battling with philosophical intuitions at that point, and there's really not much that can be said. Jacob, you have your hand up again.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to say, Katrina's point, I mean, there are great examples in the history of mathematics that more or less illustrate this role of the kind of intuitions that we have about what should be true. So the classic example is the development of the Euler formula relating the edges, vertices, and faces of, I guess it's convex polyhedra, where like people had this intuition about like what you had was a sort of back and forth between the definition of the underlying object and this like intuition that people had that this Euler type formula should be true, which is often the reason that mathematical objects have such like convoluted and weird seeming definitions, because they've developed sort of organically around kind of formalizing these intuitions we have about like what should be the case, and often need weird definitions in order to cut off certain like counterexamples that like sort of simpler and more intuitive definitions might like leave intact. So yeah, I totally affirm that point about the role of our intuitions. I would also, and I think David, I think you would also endorse this point, that at the same time, that's almost a sort of like, I don't know what you want to call it, but kind of a nominalist position about the like, I think that we might have different points of entry and different labels for those kinds of objects coming from different embodiments or different histories or something like that. But like the underlying structures are just the underlying structures, and how we carve them up and label them is sort of irrelevant.
Well, I mean, I think what the line I'm pushing, and others have said, is just how we carve them up and label them is partly pragmatic.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I remember in my logic class years ago in graduate school, my dad said, hey, W.V. Quine showed how we could have a logical system with just a stroke and like two operators or something. You could get all of the logic you needed out of that. And I thought to myself, well, that's an interesting result, but not very useful. I want the if then, I want the if and only if, I want these other symbols. Why? Well, it's useful for me, right? But even though it's the same truth that's being captured, right, by just Quine's two symbols, or two operators. So that gets back to your question too, Katrina. I mean, there really is pragmatics here. But I guess, you know, the question is how far we want to go with pragmatics, right? Whether it's all just comes down to pragmatics, like we're say, you know, the pragmatists and that whole philosophy, right? Or whether it's there's still whether pragmatics is just sort of there for how we relate to the deeper reality.